I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Queer Kid Straight Dad. Yeah, mom is gone forever. No, not forever.
Hopefully not.
No, my dad is just joining us this week because he likes to talk.
Because sometimes dads like to be involved.
And he's like a white, straight, cis man, so he like adds to our credibility or something. I don't know. We are talking about a little bit in the New York Times, a little bit about the case Dermody versus Tennessee. Mom's going to edit that out, but I just said that wrong like 6 times. And how our beloved Justice Clarence Thomas cited the New York Times like 7 times in his opinion in that case. And just how that affects trans people, how it's really intellectually dishonest, and all that good stuff.
Yes.
So for those of you who are not aware, this court case involved a Tennessee law that banned basically all gender-affirming care for transgender minors. You know, everything from surgery, which PSA isn't a thing that's happening on minors anyway, as we've discussed, and from surgery to puberty blockers, which are really one of your kind of most basic early form interventions for gender-affirming healthcare. And the Supreme Court ruled that that law is not a violation of, they were arguing equal protection, right?
Equal protection, yes. 14th Amendment.
Not a violation of equal protection under the law to say that transgender children are exempt from receiving forms of healthcare that cisgender children are allowed to receive. For instance, it's not actually that uncommon for cisgender teen boys to receive breast reduction surgery. And in that opinion, like I said, Clarence Thomas, who I believe sided with the majority ruling in favor of this law, in favor of Tennessee, but also wrote a concurring opinion stating that basically just more be worse to trans people.
You can safely assume that if Clarence Thomas is involved, that be worse to trans people is
He hates everyone.
He likes gun owners.
Oh, and he likes people who give him like private jets and stuff.
He does like business owners. Actually, he kind of likes rich, white, cis male guys. He kind of likes people like me, as long as I don't express my opinions too much.
Or like want the government to help you in any way.
Right.
Anyway, yes. And in that opinion, he cited the articles that the New York Times has run in the past couple of years, mostly, to be completely honest, opinion pieces, things that are not held to the same standards as actual journalistic pieces, you know, that don't go through the same level of rigorous reporting. We've talked about a lot of these pieces in past episodes. And the New York Times, instead of, you know, seeing that and thinking, ooh, maybe we hurt people here, maybe we should like reevaluate our choices, basically doubled down and ran a guest writer piece from Andrew Sullivan, who is reasonably well known, I think, as a quote-unquote more reasonable conservative who was also an early supporter of gay marriage back in like the 80s and 90s. However, apparently he's only interested in people getting rights insofar as it benefits him as a cisgender gay man, because his entire argument in that piece was basically, look, we should have just chilled out as soon as we got gay marriage and the Supreme Court said that gay people and trans people can't be discriminated against in employment, because now the queer rights movement is asking for too many rights and being too supportive of trans people, and it's making everybody hate me, and it's ruining my life as a gay man.
Can I cut Andrew Sullivan a little bit of white guy slack here?
Whatever.
I originally had that sort of feeling after reviewing the piece again. It's a little bit less so. There are a lot of, how do I want to put it? There's a very strong contingent of sort of people who consider themselves open-minded, but heterodox, and who really, really are leaning into the sort of stop telling me what to think kind of attitude. And when you read the column, he expresses a lot of support for equal protection of trans people. He's certainly not the worst out there. He's not articulating something that's very far out of what many centrist Democrats would also articulate. So I think that characterization might be a little bit unfair of his interpretation.
I mean, yeah, he's not saying like send trans people to death camps or something. But what he seems to be saying, from my perspective, is give trans people equal protection under the law except for the things that I think are unreasonable.
And again, just push a little pushback more that we made lots and lots of jokes in our family about, hey, we're just asking questions here. And obviously, hey, we're just asking questions can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. It can mean they're legitimate questions. It can be coded to mean, I'm just asking questions and then using that to say some really crazy things or advance some kind of bonkers conspiracies, right? I'm just asking questions about the COVID vaccine and all of these people that got the COVID vaccine and then died afterwards, right? So it depends on how generous you want to be to somebody who is asking questions. And I think in the process of maybe unpacking some of this, maybe some of those questions are okay. Maybe some of it's the response that people, sort of these heterodox, open-minded people, feel like they're getting when they try to discuss trans issues, or maybe it's more nefarious than that.
Yeah, well, I have something I want to say about that in a minute that I've been thinking about a lot the last couple of days. But first, he very explicitly states, yes, we should have equal protection under the law for trans. In fact, he seems to think that we do have equal protection under the law for trans people. Like, he seems quite convinced that the case a couple years ago that said, again, that you cannot fire a transgender woman for wanting to wear the women's uniform at work, seems to be interpreting that as trans people will never be discriminated against in an unreasonable way under an equal protections case ever again. And then in the same breath, we'll say that it's unreasonable for trans women to be allowed in women's bathrooms.
I don't think he actually brought up that.
He did. Well, he
Did
said women's intimate spaces, which
Okay,
can mean a whole
I
range of
missed
things,
that in there.
right? Like, it could mean bathrooms, could mean locker rooms, could mean domestic violence shelters, all sorts of things that trans women have been excluded from.
Okay.
Right? Which to me is a very, very clear violation of equal protection under the law, because you're saying this class of women, despite there being no evidence that they pose any harm to cisgender women, there being basically no cases of transgender women assaulting cisgender women ever, should be excluded from cisgender women's spaces because it might make cisgender women uncomfortable.
And what's really interesting to me on that, and and I hate to use the word conservative because of the current context and what's been established to that, because Andrew Sullivan is famous for an opinion piece that he wrote in 1989 called The Conservative Case for Gay Marriage. So well in advance of other conservatives making the case that gays, lesbians deserve equal protection under the law. That as a conservative, one might be really, really disturbed at the implications of what it would look like, what it does look like to enforce a bathroom ban, right? And the level of invasion of personal privacy that the government needs to engage in order to implement such a law.
Right. I mean, we already have cases coming out, just women who look more masculine or, butch lesbians, like having security guards trying to pull their pants down.
Right. And that's like, that should be, to my way of thinking, as somebody that maybe leans a little bit more towards a more historically conservative point of view, sort of a distrust of government, kind of a worry about what happens when governments and their security forces of whatever type that is overreach, right? This is really, really frightening. And we know we've talked in these podcasts before about Imani Khalif, right? A butch woman, very clearly not trans, but being attacked as being trans during the Olympics because she was too good as a biologic woman, right? And that the danger that's inherent in any of these laws, in my view, and I would think that Andrew Sullivan would agree with me on this, is that letting the government get involved in policing that just opens up all kinds of doors that are really, really frightening for personal privacy, personal freedom, the integrity of your body, all of those things.
Right. That if the government has the right to demand to see your genitals every time you use the bathroom, or to tell you what clothes you can and cannot wear, that might perhaps be regarded as an emergency.
Right.
A big part of his point throughout this article was that, back in 2021, I think 2020, the Human Rights Campaign stated that there was an emergency in terms of LGBTQ rights being rolled back, which, right, we have not lost the right to gay marriage. That is still a thing. But in a lot of ways, there are now laws saying children cannot learn about any queer people. Children cannot be in the presence of a rainbow flag. There cannot be books that reference any LGBTQ plus person in a library.
I mean, one that jumps out to me is Clarence Thomas, we mentioned before, and the opinion that he wrote in the Dobbs decision, that if something wasn't widely accepted in historical context at the time of the founding, then obviously you don't have a right to it, right? Which would very clearly include things like gay marriage, right? So there is an opinion on the books that is the law of the land, where the underlying logic says that Obergefell is clearly a mistaken case, and that we have justices on the Supreme Court who, if they follow that logic to the end, would clearly overturn that.
Right. And we have laws that, like the ones we were just talking about, that are very, very obvious attacks, not just on trans people, but any woman who wears pants, any guy who wears a kilt, anyone who wears their hair differently, anyone who doesn't want the government having the right to look at their genitals anytime they feel like it.
A female boxer that is too good at her sport.
Any female athlete that's
Any
too good at
female
her
athlete
sport.
that is too good at her sport.
Right. So I would consider that to be an emergency. You have multiple states, not to mention a significant contingent of politicians on a federal level who are actively trying to promote that kind of legal thinking, B, the idea that the government has a right to invade your privacy in those ways, and 3, also just the narrative that queer people are pedophiles who want to groom your children. You can be like, well, it's hyperbole, whatever, but I don't think calling it an emergency is that out there.
I mean, it's a lobbying group that's trying to raise money for pursuing their goals, and anybody that receives fundraising emails from Republicans, which I unfortunately still do, Democrats, right? There's always an emergency.
Right.
Environmental organizations, gun rights organizations, there is always, always, always an emergency.
Do I get to write an op-ed in the New York Times every time I get an email from Kamala Harris telling me there's an emergency?
Right.
Like, yeah, I mean, just putting aside the question of the legitimacy of whether, people should consider an emergency. Yeah, they're a fundraising group. Good point.
And if you don't like the hyperbole, fine, like whatever. I'm sympathetic to political groups should use less hyperbole in their lobbying efforts, fundraising efforts, all of the things that they do. We could all use a lot less hyperbole, but that seems like a really minute thing to fixate on.
Right, because I mean, if you call everything an emergency, then how do you communicate when
Then
something is actually an emergency, right? Fair enough, but I don't see him complaining about every other group that does that. And if we're also used to things being called an emergency, like, why are you freaking out about this specific instance? Yeah. If we then go back to this idea about, how people will say, I'm just asking questions. Because you're right, that is something that comes up a lot all along the range of intentions, from just wanting an excuse to beat trans people up to people who legitimately want to be supportive. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but I've been thinking about it. And what's really frustrating to me about Andrew Sullivan here is that he should know what it's like to have your personal life and your basic rights picked apart in the public eye.
Yes. Although, again, I'll be a little bit generous to Mr. Sullivan here. He mentioned this in the opinion piece that he wrote, that he spent a lot of time in the 90s and early 2000s, which I don't know if viewers and listeners remember, or old enough to remember, how we were on the cusp of having a national constitutional amendment prohibiting gay marriage in the early 2000s. That there were a lot of threats. And he was undertaking a lot of work in conservative circles, going to Mormon churches, Catholic churches, religious groups in places like Montana and Idaho. And so his mindset is probably much more in respectability politics and trying to make the respectable case for gay marriage to a lot of people that easily get turned off by some of the more radical aspects of what was clearly happening, right? If you went to a gay pride parade in the early 90s in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., right? It was pretty wild stuff. There was a lot going on. And so he's definitely pushing a little c conservative approach to making gay marriage acceptable to a wider swath of American society, right? And so I'm guessing that his viewpoint is a little bit colored by that particular experience.
Which is fine, but there are also a lot of trans activists out there who are doing the same thing, right? Who are saying, we would just like to be able to pee. We would just like to be able to play sports. No one is trying to do XYZ.
Agreed.
And he seems...
He could lift up some of those voices instead of pretending that they don't exist.
And again, it's not even that there's a problem with doing that work. It's just he seems utterly unsympathetic to the idea that if I'm a trans person and I started hormone therapy and it changed my life and it stopped me from committing suicide, I am going to naturally react negatively to someone telling me that you're just making that up.
Yes.
Healthcare doesn't really prevent suicide, or even just, but I think you should ask more questions. Did it really stop you from committing suicide? Are you sure? We need to do more research.
Well, okay. Now let's again, in fairness, right? We have gold standards for medical research, right? And so if we as people who are sympathetic to, or me as a old white guy that's sympathetic to basic issues of rights for trans people, like we ought to have good data collected and verified through gold standard studies and processes to prove that the things that we are claiming actually work.
But this is the problem, right? Is that he actually published, like this piece was published after, just in the last couple of months, there have been multiple examples of, one would be Utah, right? I think I mentioned this last week or 2 weeks ago, where lawmakers in Utah, as a justification for passing a law restricting transgender healthcare, said, we need to do more research into this issue. We need to have a committee prepare a report on whether these interventions are actually useful. Well, a year later, committee comes back and says, yeah, it looks like these are good for people. Have they gotten rid of the law? No, they have not.
And that's fair, right? There's good faith approaches to that, and there's bad faith approaches to that.
And there was another report that just came out last week, right? That was, oh, look, a statistically non-existent number of people are detransitioning. It's not a thing that really happens. And when it does happen, it's mostly because it's too hard to continue to transition. And presumably he had access to this information, and he chose to push this narrative that there's no information out there anyway, that he's just asking questions because information doesn't exist.
And I think that's fair. And I think people that are in a position of influence and some sort of level of ability to communicate these issues to people sort of have a higher standard. I think we've all sort of devolved to the Facebook and Twitter spot of where, the guys that I know at work, like, see some headlines and see some stuff in the news and this feels like kind of weird, right? Like there should probably be more research. And I do think that people writing in the New York Times ought to be expected to have a higher standard of up-to-date information.
And that the editors and publishers of the New York Times should be like, oh, hey, dude, you just said something that's blatantly inaccurate.
Right.
Like maybe you should go back and review these studies and update your piece accordingly.
And again, like when we talk about those studies, the Supreme Court referenced this, and a lot of the commenters on the Supreme Court case mentioned this. The studies that we have don't yet prove that gender-affirming care reduces suicide because they're not robust. They don't have big enough sample sizes, right? It's really hard because population sizes are so small. It's really, really difficult to do. But we do know that if you pass a law prohibiting any of those sorts of treatments, then your sample size won't ever get any bigger. Like you actually need to do the studies, you need to have the cases in order to process that. And then we do also have not robust, but anecdotal evidence. We have a lot of people who receive gender affirming care who have good outcomes, which isn't the gold standard, right? It doesn't prove it, but it's one of those arrows that points us in the direction where we hypothesize, test, verify.
Also, if we're talking about, something that is kind of a squishy, like it's a medical issue, but it's also a psychological issue, like does a certain thing reduce suicide? First of all, if you have anecdotal evidence suggesting that something does reduce suicide, there's a case to be made that it's actively unethical to take away access to something that reduces suicide, even if the evidence is only anecdotal. There are cases where we do not do double-blind studies because it would be actively unethical.
Improvements in vaccines. We don't give somebody a placebo on a vaccine that we know works and let them get sick to test out a better vaccine.
Right. And also, in more psychological fields, obviously it's great to have like large sample sizes and to have, really empirical quantitative studies. But when you have studies that have been done, that are tracing a few individuals over a span of years, when you have a lot of people who are saying that, this was life-saving for me, should there be more research? Absolutely. Should that research actively take away useful interventions? No, it should not. We also shouldn't act like there's no data out there, because even if it's not really hard quantitative research, qualitative research is still valuable.
It is valuable. right? And that's one of the really disturbing things in a lot of the discussion over that is because the qualitative data is not great at it. And then it makes sense, right? I was right before the show, I was looking up the number of gender reassignment surgeries among minors, and we're talking about fewer than 300 cases a year, right? It's really hard to game out long-term results on that. So you are left with a lot of qualitative. And the other thing that came to mind as I was sort of processing this, and I brought it up to you before we started recording, is that Donald Trump and the Republicans made a really, really big show of signing right to try legislation for people that were dealing with life-threatening illnesses in 2018. And it's a really interesting contradiction to very, very rare cases in the state of Tennessee where a minor might request, or the minor and their family and their doctor might see gender reassignment or some sort of surgical intervention as a life-saving alternative, right? So we've said, oh, you got a right to try over here, but you don't have a right to try when it comes to trans issues, right? And it's sort of that like inconsistency is really, really difficult to square.
Well, you also brought up, that this is individuals, maybe their families and their doctors who are making these decisions. And that was another thing that I thought was really disingenuous about Andrew Sullivan's article, was that he was saying that essentially that, trans activists are demanding that all institutions like push this ideology onto people, that children have to be taught that they're actually not the gender that they were assigned.
Right. He actually specifically said that kids are being taught in school that they get to choose their gender, which it probably has happened. Never say never. We're a country with 350 million people. Like, yes, 42 million kids or 45 million kids under the age of 18. It probably has happened. But is that really the context in which most kids are experiencing this?
Right. Like, it's not a matter of, okay, everybody, now we're all going to try on different outfits just to make sure that we don't like
Yep.
being the other gender better. It's like, oh, you want to wear a skirt to school? Yeah, that's fine. Try it out. Sure, why not?
Yeah, and you see this in a lot of the just asking questions that you would be forgiven. I reference the guys that I go to work with that aren't paying attention to this in detail. You might be forgiven if they pick up this column and read through, believing some of these things about how common surgical interventions are, right? How common puberty blockers are for children under 18 and children under 16, right? Like, I do think that the general public thinks that this is happening hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times every year, rather than being pretty rare interventions that are undertaken with very, very serious thought by doctors, by families who are looking for, like, really in a lot of cases in desperation for solutions or for treatments to a very real problem that they're experiencing.
Yeah, it's like he's living it well, and I said this earlier. It's like maybe my dude has spent too much time on Twitter.
Yes.
Like, because it seems like he is getting all of these perspectives. Well, he cites a lot of perspectives, right? He cites perspectives either from the like conservative people in his own circles, or the perspective of I love Mao 22 on Twitter.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is a very frustrating thing to me, right? And I think everyone could be better about to stop taking people on the internet seriously. The internet just absolutely brings out the worst in people. I almost never read the comment section, and anytime I read the comment section, I immediately regret it. People have no reading comprehension.
Hmm.
They're just ridiculous. Like, people are just trying to start fights, and it's true of everyone. It's true of all political groups. It just brings out the worst in people. And there's no point in taking it seriously.
Right. I think the habitual online nature of a lot of our politics and a lot of our social discourse really leads to some skewed perspectives. I remember seeing a survey ask the general public, what percentage of the population do you think is, and you can fill in this blank.
I was just thinking of that survey.
It could be gun owners, it could be gay, it could be trans. And the numbers with trans are like what you're
30%.
Yeah, that's what I have in my head, is that the average person thinks that 30% of the population is trans. And so if you think that, if you go to go down to the high school and you look around and you're like, oh my God, 1 out of every 3 of these kids is trans. And if even 10% of those are going to get top or bottom surgery, right? Like, that's like mind boggling, and like, that's really scary. And of course a lot of those kids would regret that later on down in life, right? Which is why, generally speaking, right, we have professional codes of conduct for therapists and for doctors, that we don't just perform these things willy-nilly anytime a 9-year-old comes in and says, "Hey, mom, I want to be a girl today." Okay, let's pack you up and get gender reassignment surgery. Right? Like, but from the very online public, from the Andrew Sullivans and the Barry Weisses and that group, you would think that that is a really common occurrence.
Right. And I mean, right, there are also people, professors maybe, academics, who are kind of gaming out scenarios like, well, where do we get our ideas of what age is appropriate for consent from, right? And then they start exploring those things and unpacking those things. And it's interesting, right? There's a lot of interesting theorizing out there. But people will go on one of those people's Twitter page and be like, oh my God, they're saying children can consent to sex.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. So conclusion is that we should all spend a lot less time getting that information off the internet, and we should process these as very serious cases in a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
And that maybe an instance like Tennessee banning all gender-affirming care in all cases might be an appropriate response if 1/3 of students are claiming gender dysphoria.
And they're all getting surgery.
And they're all getting surgery, or they're all getting puberty blockers.
Right.
But maybe that if it's something that's going to happen in the state of Tennessee once every other year, once every third or fourth year, that maybe that ought to be handled on a case-by-case basis by the people that are closest to it,
And the people
not
who are experts.
by the people who are at a legislative body and state medical board of practitioners ought to pay careful attention for anybody abusing that and going beyond bounds of professional practice or not acting in a responsible and professional manner, because those things happen. Doctors are certainly human like the rest of us, but maybe a blanket ban is a little over the top.
I mean, there's one more thing that I do want to talk about, which is that Mr. Sullivan seems to think that people advocating for trans rights are basically destroying gays and lesbians. In a couple of different ways, he makes the argument. First of all, that because the public doesn't like trans people, they are, and most gay and lesbian people are supportive of trans people, that means that now the entire public hates all gay people, which, if whatever. And then also that if we allow trans kids to have access to resources and to not immediately shut down their questioning their gender identity, that will lead to all gays and lesbians who are children being like, what if I'm actually trans? Which you're probably not going to have as many thoughts on this because it's not something that you have personal experience with. But to me, that really rubbed me the wrong way because there's so many reasons. The thing that immediately comes to mind is that he talks about, a lot of these are actually just same-sex attracted kids who are going to find out that they're gay in the future and not want to be another gender. There are also there's a significant number of trans people out there who will tell you, yeah, I thought I was gay or I thought I was a lesbian before I figured out that I was trans. And then I was so confused because I was like, well, I'm not really attracted to boys or girls or whatever, but like I'm feminine or I'm masculine, so I have to be gay because that's the only option. That is also a real thing that happens. I know people in my personal life who have experienced that. And so a lot of people will come out as trans and then subsequently come out as gay after that. Like they had previously said, I'm a lesbian, I'm only attracted to women. And then they come out as a transgender man and they're like, I'm actually a gay man. I just couldn't process that because I was so confused about my gender identity.
And I don't really have thoughts on that other than teenagers in particular, but really all humans. Human sexuality, gender, all of that is it's complicated and it's changing, right? It always shifts and people always have different experiences and it's emotional. And putting all of the trans issues out into public, right? Because this has become obviously much more normalized is that's not quite the right word I'm looking for, but it's in normal conversation. You hear about it all the time, right? It's on the news right now. The president's making it a focus that we erase trans people out of record books, right? So it's a political issue. It's all out there, but it's complicated and it's emotional. And there are a lot of ways in which people can really be hurt right? And I think there are a lot of worries. I think there are a lot of people, maybe like the Andrew Sullivans, that have legitimate concerns about what happens if we go too far and where is the line for going too far and when medical professionals commit malpractice or, in the area of sports. Like there are clearly instances of trans women who have gained an advantage, and they're mostly really obscure, right? They're mostly like amateur weightlifting in, Kalamazoo or whatever, as opposed to a lot of the more complicated Olympic level sports, right? But there's a very clear way in which that could be abused, right? And to my way of thinking, the little C conservatives, me and the Andrew Sullivan, should be looking around at the world and we should say, oh, I could see how that'd go off the rails in a hurry. We should pay attention to that. Could a man use a trans excuse and use it to assault women in a bathroom? Yeah, I mean, that's like, it could happen. Like, so let's pay attention and let's see if that becomes a problem. It becomes something we need to address. Or it could be that it's something that's been going on for years, decades, centuries, millennia, and we haven't noticed, or it's been such a non-issue that now, because it's talked about, now we feel like this need to I would call it overreact in a lot of cases. But maybe just little C conservative, maybe just like learn what you can learn, engage with grace and compassion and empathy for all kinds of people. And when there's a real problem, then address the real problem as opposed to seeing, a rapist in every women's bathroom stall.
Yeah, like, I don't know. I feel like everyone could just be a lot more chill. Because here's the thing. If a kid that everyone thinks is a little boy wants to wear a dress to school, okay, cool. If I'm a parent, I'm going to be like, great, you do that. Absolutely, no problem. And I don't want you to get bullied. And if
Mhm.
kids are mean to you, that's a problem. We should probably make sure that kids are learning that we shouldn't bully people who dress differently. And if you wear a dress for a day and then you decide you're done, okay, no problem. If you decide you want to change your name and grow your hair out, okay, cool. It's a whole, like, it's just, I feel like people see that response and then are like, oh my God, you're brainwashing him.
Yeah, I feel, and like I said, I can see how people have an emotional response to something that feels weird, feels abnormal, right? And we do that all the time to all sorts of things that feel abnormal, right? That's where racism comes from. That's where some sexism comes from, right? That's where the backlash against gays, right, that Andrew Sullivan writes about comes from. Like all of these things, the cultural other, whatever it is. But yeah, the overreaction, just maybe everybody chill out.
And like I said, it's also just exhausting as a trans person to be like, I I can point you to some studies if you would like, but why are you screaming about whether I have the right to exist?
Why are you shutting me down? Why are you infringing on my free speech?
Like, it's exhausting, man.
Yeah. And I can see how if you've offered, maybe not to the third or fourth person, but when you've offered studies and you've offered actual data and numbers, and then the seventh or eighth or ninth person, and some of those were operating in bad faith, right? And then that seventh or eighth or ninth person, maybe they were operating in
Right,
good
'cause
faith,
if
and you're a little bit exhausted and a little bit tired from.
if you are if 10 different people to come to me and are like, "I'm just curious about this gender affirming care thing," and I'm like, "Yeah, here, let me show you some research." Nope, it's child abuse. By the 11th person, I'm gonna be like, "Stop being transphobic. I don't want to talk to you."
Right, which clearly isn't a great response, right? We're all supposed to be more patient and but whatever, but it's hard. It's really,
But
really
I
hard to
don't
maintain
think
that.
that's like, I don't think that's a level of grace that you can necessarily expect the average. We cannot all be Shohei Ohtani.
Well, we could, yes. Shout out to Otani for his grace and composure in a really high stress situation.
Well, and this is the thing, right? If you're a public facing individual, if you're Sarah McBride, say, absolutely we can expect that of you because you put
Yes.
yourself in that position, right? If I'm just me walking down the street and every single time someone talks to me, they're like, I want to know about gender affirming therapy and have a debate with you, that's a really big burden to put on someone just because of like how they exist in the world.
And likewise, if you're a public figure just asking questions, you ought to take some steps and make sure that the questions that you're asking haven't been adequately discussed, researched, right? To cherry pick data or, to offer up red herrings, right? All of the sort of logical fallacies that we're supposed to learn about in school, and to use those in a public facing forum like the New York Times is a little bit, well, it's a lot destructive.
Hmm. So there you go. I think our takeaways here are just like chill out. Don't spend too much time on the internet, which I think will facilitate the chilling out. Don't expect people who are not in public facing positions to educate you all the time. And if you are in a public facing position, take some personal accountability. That means you, Mr. Sullivan.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to level with you. I have absolutely no idea what we're talking about next time. So it's going to be a fun surprise. Maybe that makes it more enticing to tune in 2 weeks. I don't know. But
A nice little teaser.
yeah, there you go. We've been doing it wrong this whole time.
Go up and find out.
You have to find out. Thank you for hanging out.
Well,
And
thanks for
talking.
having me.
Everybody enjoy summer. It's at least getting quite nice here. See you in 2 weeks. Bye.
If you found this episode interesting, informative, amusing, please review and follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. Getting those reviews and follows really helps us show up more in the algorithm and be able to reach more people to help them. You can find us on social media, Instagram, and Threads at queerkid.straightmom, Blue Sky at qksm.bsky.social, and Facebook at queerkidstraightmom. We are no longer on Twitter